Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman, actually wearing a different hat today, Friday, March 28th, day 539 of the war. Today, instead of being our diplomatic reporter, Lazar will also put on his hat of the Christian affairs reporter. So would that be a kippah kind of hat, Lazar, that you're putting on, or more of a Pope's kind of hat this time?
Well, the Pope also has those red kippot, so I probably should have worn one of those.
Maybe you can have your kippah under the Pope hat, and that would just cover all bases, right?
Cover it all, absolutely.
Okay, so we're here actually to talk about Christians in Israel. We're going to talk about some of the actual prejudice and violence and discrimination faced by Christians here in Israel, which makes up about 2% of the population. So keep that number in mind when we're back. Lazar, Jews in the United States make up about 2% of the population. And I think for anyone who grew up in North America like you and I did, hearing that number 2% and then hearing about all the really terrible and shameful acts of discrimination against Christians, mostly perpetrated by the ultra-Orthodox community, including spitting, it could be, defacement or name-calling, all sorts of acts of discrimination against the Christian community. Don't you think that hearing that 2% number, which is basically the population of Jews in the United States, if not North America, that kind of sets the stage in a way for any of our listeners who are listening from North America to understand what a minority population Christians are in Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes when I talk to people about Christians in Israel, or the fact that in addition to my diplomacy, I like to make sure that we are actually covering the plight and the concerns of Christians in Israel, Christian churches around the world who have some of their most important properties and sites and shrines in Israel, especially in Jerusalem. And they ask me, why does it matter? There's plenty of reasons why it matters. We can go to diplomatic, we can go to democratic, we can go to religious reasons. But I think a very easy one to grasp is, given Jews' experience when we were the minority, usually amongst a Christian majority, and anyone that knows anything about Jewish history knows that generally, or quite often, there was all sorts of discrimination against Jews at best and genocidal violence at worst. And now we're in a unique situation where we as Jews are the majority. We set the tone. We decide what laws and what general society is going to look like. And there are several minorities, but you also have a Christian minority. So this is a unique situation, which hasn't been the case in 2,000 years, where you have a Christian minority within a Jewish majority. And I think we are facing the test of how we treat that minority, whether we make sure we learn all the lessons from our experiences. And we make sure that, as we say, this is a tolerant society that not only allows people to have the freedom of practice and the right to have their persons and their property safe from attack, but the minority communities can thrive even if they don't agree with us on everything. I think that's something that hopefully all Israelis want. I know that it's something most Israelis want, but we have to pay attention to what these communities are saying and what we can do to make this country fit more closely to the ideal that we have in our minds.
Right. And there are many, many, many different kinds of Christians who have churches here, who have some kind of headquarters here, especially in Jerusalem, where we're sitting right now in our Jerusalem office. And I think it's confusing in a way to try and piece together why this is taking place at all, especially to me, the idea of religious Jews spitting on Christians. The very fact of spitting, which I find so incredibly disgusting, the idea of spitting on a person. So what I heard, I don't know if it's an urban legend or if it's actually true, is that in rabbinic literature, there are actually halachot, or at least dictums by the rabbis to spit on the idolater. And is this where it's coming from, Lazar?
When people want to find justification for doing these types of things, and they want to claim, as in the past you had an Otzma Yehudit Knesset staffer say publicly that this is something that Jews do based on halakha. He was swatted down by a range of rabbinical sources. But yeah, when they want to root it in there, they say very simply, Christianity is idolatry. There are sources that want us to spit at idolatry, and therefore we have to spit when we see crosses in the Jewish quarter, in the Old City, and we walk by churches. Now, there's plenty of other halachic sources to push back against that. One that came about in a certain reality where Jews were, again, a minority, and the only way they had to kind of express anything was these either rhetorical statements within Jewish texts or these small kind of acts of resistance, like spitting at the majority that mistreated them. The situation is totally different now. Again, we are the majority. We are responsible ethically, legally, morally for the safety of priests that live here, of pilgrims that come here, and the Christians that are citizens and residents of Israel. So that situation is different. And then there's also all sorts of sources about sanctifying God's name, not making religion, especially Jewish religion, look bad. Obviously, when there are these attacks on just a priest walking around or Christian pilgrims that came to Jerusalem to worship, which is something that Jewish texts envision and want to have happen. When that happens, there's nothing that blackens God's name more. So I would say there's plenty of textual evidence that what these people are doing is not only not backed up, but violates a whole range of halachot.
So let's break down a little bit the violence that is being perpetrated against Christians and which type of Christians. Is it the Christian pilgrims? Is it the native Christians, again, about 2% of Israeli population? Or is it something other entirely?
It's a good question. So it's not like there are mass, physical assaults on the street or, arson or those type of attacks, right? Christians live in Israel, visit Israel, worship Israel, and are safe doing so. The population of Christians in Israel continues to grow. It's not necessarily from local Christians. Their communities are not necessarily growing because there's a lot of immigration, and we could talk about why. But there's also people that move here that might be from the former Soviet Union who come as Jews but are Christians, and all sorts of other groups that move here, live here. So in broadly, the Christian community is indeed growing.
I just want to add one thing to what you said. You said who come as Jews. It's quite possible that they came on the law of return, which means that one of their grandparents was Jewish, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are claiming they're Jewish. No, just that one of their grandparents was Jewish. And then, of course, they're granted citizenship here, even if they are not Jews themselves, right?
Right. And then there are other Christians who marry Israelis, so then they gain citizenship as well. So there's different ways where it's not necessarily the local communities that are growing. But if you ask Christians, and there's been polls about this, including one from the Rossen Center, especially up north, whether they feel safe here, whether they feel integrated, you have very, very high numbers that say yes. Though there have been attacks on Christian sites in the north, it's generally focused, really the hot spot is Jerusalem, especially the Old City.
I mean, Jerusalem is the center of the world, obviously, and the Old City is the epicenter of the center. So that makes a lot of sense to me. But before we drill down into Jerusalem, I just want to talk a little bit more about the communities in the north. And these are more of the indigenous communities, as it were, meaning people who have families who have lived here for generations and generations. It's mostly not the Catholics, if I'm not mistaken. It's mostly some of the Orthodox traditions, the Syrian or the Armenian even. Do you know, Lazar?
Yeah, mostly generally Palestinian Christians, whether they're Israeli citizens or in the West Bank, are Greek Orthodox is the biggest sect. You also have significant number of Maronites. There are some Roman Catholics, some Armenians, but generally it's Greek Orthodox or Catholic are the major denominations.
Okay, so let's talk about Jerusalem. And anyone who hasn't been here, well, number one, should come. But if you have been here and you can cast your mind to the old city, you'll know immediately that there's so many different traditions being represented within the old city. And there's no one place that really encompasses them more than the Holy Sepulchre Church. And even within that church, there's something like, what, a dozen different traditions sharing the space? Is that right, Lazar?
I believe it's 18, but there are five dominant ones. But yeah, there are many different sects, including, let's say, the Ethiopians, who only have the roof. It's generally Greek Orthodox. Catholics have really the significant sections, but then there's a Syriac section, Armenian. So there's a lot of different sects sharing that holy space. And of course, in Jerusalem, there's that same type of tense arrangement. You might have heard the status quo, which is when the Ottoman Empire got sick of this fighting between the different groups, which often turned violent, even sparked a war in Europe. And they wanted to kind of lock in what the different privileges and rights are of the different Christian communities within their holy sites.
Okay, so within just the old city itself, all sorts of different traditions, but also within that old city, there's, of course, the Jewish quarter, there's the Muslim quarter, and the Armenian quarter, which is, they're usually Christians, from what I understand. So there's a lot going on in this kilometer on kilometer walled city. And a lot of the violence that we're hearing about, at least against the Christians, is happening in the old city. But I just don't understand still why it's happening at all.
Right. Yeah. So the old city, like you said, it's four quarters, but those quarters aren't necessarily only that tradition. So the Via Dolorosa, which is the road where Jesus went on his final journey before he was crucified, starts in the Muslim quarter and ends up in the Holy Sepulchre Church. The Christian and Muslim quarter are the biggest quarters with significant sites, Latin Patriarchate, Greek Orthodox, basically major countries around the world that are Christian before the state of Israel. So in the 1800s, they wanted to kind of show their global importance by making sure that they had a foothold here in Jerusalem, including Germans. So that was, kind of the origin of many of these major churches here. Many of them go much further back, but it's also a diplomatic issue because these countries continue to maintain that connection, and you see these diplomatic blowups that sometimes dominate the entire trip when something happens at one of those churches between the Israeli authorities and worshipers. Now, it's the old city, like you said, because there's a lot of priests that walk around there in their distinctive garb. There's a lot of pilgrims in normal times. Since October 7, 2023, there's been fewer pilgrims, but it's also outside the old city. Mount Zion is especially a flashpoint, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, you have a single building where you have three different faiths who have structures on it. You have the tomb of King David, which is a Jewish site. You have the Cenaculum, which is the room of the Last Supper, which is a Christian site, which there's some tension within the Christian sects over what the status quo there is and who has rights there. And then there's also a mosque structure up on top, even though it's not actively used. So it's a site that is already quite fraught. And at the same time, that it was over the years kind of a no man's land. It was the closest place that Jews could get to the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, during the years when Jordan held the old city. There are churches that hold ground there. There's some Muslim families that have ground there. And there's also this diaspora yeshiva. And over the years, there's been kind of these lost Orthodox youth that have kind of either been affiliated with the yeshiva, have found places to live. Sometimes you'll see people kind of sleeping out on the street here. And then there's also this garden, which is this undeveloped field held by the Greek Orthodox Church, where also you see Jews, do bonfires there, sometimes religious rituals, sometimes camp out there. So there's all sorts of different ownership, and it has attracted, in addition to all the people that are doing wonderful things there and worshiping and visiting, but these kind of Orthodox youth on the margins of society. And recently, there's been a rise in the desire and also the willingness to carry out might seem minor attacks, spitting, maybe a couple of words, but when you add them up, it creates this environment of squeezing out the comfort of Christians here. So when they feel like whenever they have to walk around, they have to be on their guard that someone might spit at them, toward them, might say something, that does not make them feel, first of all, welcome, and also doesn't make them feel very safe. And when you talk to, I mean, there's reports about this, and you have the numbers. I believe there was 46, looking at the Rossing Center attack, 46 of these documented spitting attacks over the past year. But when you ask any of the priests, they say this is almost a daily occurrence. They generally don't report them all because if someone's just walking, disappears, how are the police going to find them? And they also say the police should be much more vigilant about that. So that is kind of the squeezing attacks, where it's just a general, regular occurrence of spitting, of making them feel unwelcome. Again, generally by kind of Haredi nationalists, what you might call Hardal youth, some call them hilltop youth, that type of thing, where it's young Jewish Orthodox males who carry this out regularly.
You know, Lazar, you're talking about this, and I just am imagining the opposite scenario, say, you know, Jews being spat upon in, say, Belgium, for example. And can you just imagine the uproar that that would cause? And it's just fascinating in a way to understand that it isn't exactly this huge diplomatic issue. And I just also don't understand why that would be, because it is such a terrible thing for these Christian priests or whoever, the Christians in general, to be spat upon by these Israeli, presumably Israeli young men almost every day. How can this be happening?
So first of all, it's not necessarily spat upon, but it's kind of spat demonstrably in their direction, or when a procession goes by. There have been some actual physical attacks. There was a famous story of a German Catholic priest in February, and he was doing middle of doing an interview with German TV, and you see a young Orthodox man start cursing him out, and even got somewhat physical. The police ended up arresting the perpetrator there. But you're right. When this happens in Europe, we make a huge deal of it. We expect the authorities there, and even the president or prime minister of these countries, to make a statement and to condemn it. And if we are so vigilant about it when it takes place to Jewish minorities abroad, we need to have the same sort of outreach here. We shouldn't wait for the French or the Italians or the Germans to bring it up. It should be that leaders here condemn it unequivocally every time. Now, over the past, certainly before the war, when our attention has been taken elsewhere, but there was definitely a trend where Israeli leaders were taking this much more seriously. After an attack at a Haifa monastery, the Stella Maris, where you had some Breslov Hasidim who started kind of aggressively praying outside, wanting to get in because they say that's where a Jewish prophet is buried. Then you had the president who went there and met with them. You had the chief rabbis condemn it. You had the prime minister, the foreign minister talk about it. So it's important that Jewish leaders continue, even during a time of war, to condemn this. But it really has to be something that A, Israelis are aware of, and B, they understand why it's so problematic, and they're vigilant about stopping it. It can't be something that we just shrug our shoulders and say, okay, whatever, someone, spit on the ground, it's not that serious. When it's happening to you and you're a minority, it can be quite serious.
Okay, so now I would like you to take off your Pope hat and let's discuss this on the level of diplomacy a little more. And you and I discussed in one of our first Friday Foci focuses.
Foci.
Friday we'll say Foci. One of our first Friday Foci, we were talking about Israel and also more broadly the Jews' relationship with the Catholic Church. And as we know, the current Pope, who is now out of the hospital, the current Pope is not necessarily proven to be such a strong ally of Israel during this war. And I just wonder if potentially this, snowballing of all the attacks against his priests could be playing some role in this.
I think there's deeper reasons that go back to the way he was raised and his priorities around the world that lead him to take some of the positions he has on Israel, on the war, even on the relations with Jews in general. Um, and it's not necessarily only Catholic priests who are being attacked, but in general, it certainly affects our relationship with these major churches. Again, these are organizations that have sometimes over a billion, but certainly hundreds of millions of followers. Our closest allies in the world are Christian countries. When countries like, especially from Europe, when they come to Israel, part of the diplomatic agenda is the fate of local Christian communities. So it's certainly true with France, Italy, Spain, and other countries as well. So beyond the internal, state of Israel's democracy and freedom of religion and freedom from harm, there's also a diplomatic cost to the fact that this continues to go on. I wouldn't say it's snowballing; it's persisting. Um, People that look into this say that there has been a rise since the current government came in, not because the current government is condoning it in any way, but there is a feeling amongst people that think that there shouldn't be Christians here or any other religious minority, that they are allowed to do things because of the makeup of the government, especially talking about the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. They kind of feel like it's a permissive environment. That's the claim made by some of these experts that study this topic. So it's not a snowballing effect. It's not like it's getting out of control. The police are certainly aware of it and deal with it. And they have their own claims. They say whatever it's reported to us, we handle it. It has to be reported to us, or else we can't do anything about it. And they have done a number of types of operations and new types of deployment to deal with this. But there's proof is in the pudding, right? It's not being stopped entirely. There's also some claims I'm a little less sympathetic with. In this Roslin Center report, there's a claim that restrictions on major Christian ceremonies, like the ceremony of the Holy Fire and the Holy Sepulchre, these major ceremonies where you have thousands of worshipers packed into these ancient structures, and when the police restrict the number of people, they say that is a violation of the status quo and it affects religious freedom. This really started being restricted after that terrible Meron disaster, where there was a massive religious festival, not a lot of control, and afterward there was an expectation that the police and the fire authorities would really be careful and make sure that all the proper permits were given, and they're doing that not only for Jewish ceremonies but also for Christian. So to say that comes from a place of religious prejudice, or is effectively religious prejudice, I think is a step too far. However, it does point at the need for open and ongoing dialogue between all the parties involved to make sure that everyone understands what the needs are, in a way to do this in a safe way, but one that doesn't leave religious minorities feeling like they are not able to carry out their sacred services and some of their most sacred observances in Jerusalem, in Israel.
Yeah, you began talking about how the Christian community here in Israel is basically at the same level, but that the, shall we call it, native Christian population has actually migrated. And that's, of course, true throughout the Middle East, not just in Israel. And it's potentially true that in Israel, the Christian community is even more stable than it is elsewhere, such as in Iraq or Syria, etc. So talk to us a little bit more about this migration of the native Christians who have been living here for generations.
Yeah, so in general, Christians in the Middle East are generally they're not armed usually. Lebanon's kind of an exception there, where you have Christian armies, but in general, they have better connections with the West. They have families in the West. The fact that they have co-religionists in Europe or the United States means when there is war, when there's economic trouble, they're much more likely to migrate, and it's much easier for them to do so. That's true across the Middle East. It's also true in Israel. And Christians will say that they're kind of stuck. First of all, they're a minority within the minority. So within Israel, you have the Arab minority, and that is generally the Muslim voice. That's the one that is able to speak most effectively with the authorities. They have much more political power. And the Christians are within that only a minority, and oftentimes they're kind of seen by the Israeli public writ large as, this is the Arab sector, and there's not a distinction between the needs and priorities of the Christians versus the Muslims. They also feel like they're caught in between a fight between whether you want to call it Islamic extremism, terrorists, oftentimes there's Palestinian nationalism, even though Christians were very much a part of that. But whatever conflicts they are, it's generally they're not a party to it, but they're often caught in the middle. So when Israel cracked down in 2002 during the Second Intifada, it wasn't Christians that were carrying out the terrorist attacks, right? It was either Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or Fatah groups. But that affected a lot of Christians as well. When there is a security barrier that's put up through the West Bank, that means Christians in the West Bank are cut off from their churches and their communities in Jerusalem. And they'll feel it now as well when, the economy, there's a downturn even within Israel. And when there's tensions and it doesn't feel like communities are necessarily, there's not that same sort of feeling that they're all in the same boat or that same feeling of comfort with each other, that is also something that can affect the desire to emigrate. And very high numbers, I think it's around 50% of Christians in the North are saying that, especially young Christians actually, are saying that that's something they consider, for economic opportunity, for safety reasons. Again, it's not like we're Iraq or Syria or even Lebanon, where there is going to be real danger of violence and being uprooted. But these are more subtle things that they would like to have, economic prosperity, know that their communities can grow and not have there be violence around them. There's also the issue of violence within the Arab sector. Oftentimes, usually Christians live alongside Muslims. Sometimes they live in mixed cities, but sometimes it's just Christians, Muslims, maybe Druze. And when there are these gangs that we've talked about, these a lot of the organized crime up in the north is from these Arab crime families, these Muslim crime families. Sometimes it's Druze as well. But if they feel like the police are not taking care of those criminal elements and allowing them to have businesses without paying protection money and things along those lines, that also is a reason that the state is not getting a hold on things that have to do with quality of life, like crime. So all those reasons, again, it's a squeezing, it's a feeling that maybe their future isn't in the region. And if that's so, I think then we are failing as a society.
So it sounds to me from what you're saying that the Israeli government, the Israeli institutions, such as the police, are plus minus actually on board with the Christians and trying to help the Christians and trying to clamp down on this violence and prejudice against them. But it also sounds to me like a lot of work needs to be done, perhaps among other religious leaders. And I know throughout the world, there are always coexistence efforts. And in North America, obviously, it's extremely popular. What is happening here in Israel? Is there any kind of cooperation, for example, between, I don't know, the chief rabbis and the patriarch here or the custos from the Catholic Church? Do you know anything about that?
So they're certainly in touch with each other. I don't know if there's any specific initiative that comes from the chief rabbis. The chief rabbis are vocal, but it's reactive. It's when there is a problem, they come out and condemn it, which is important. There are also effective NGOs. There's one that has done great work on, like I said, Mount Zion, getting that place where people are more comfortable with each other, where there is less tension, where if something comes up even innocently, let's say there are Jews who are celebrating, it's a Malava Malka after Shabbat and the music is too loud. It doesn't get tense and spiral into anything. And when there are incidents, everyone knows how to talk to each other. So there are good efforts there as well. But in general, I would say Israeli society feels like it has bigger problems to deal with. And I think most people, if you ask their average person, say, listen, we have wars, we have hostages now, we have some serious threats around us. We have police that they can deal with that, but it doesn't have to be a national priority. Hopefully there are more proactive efforts. And, the Rossen Center report, which I encourage everyone to take a look at and dig into the stats and into some of the cases as well. They have recommendations, whether it's better education in Israeli public schools about what Christianity is, what the community here is, what their needs are, so they can be familiar with it. It won't be something that is seen as hostile or some sort of weird idolatry. And that the police have better training and are more proactive in making sure that they are preventing these attacks, and when it happens, that they are arresting them, and that local Christians, local pilgrims, and pilgrims as well, know where to go to report this and the importance of reporting any attacks, because when they do it, then it can be properly dealt with, and not to just see someone spitting and say, okay, whatever, that's not very nice, but to understand there's a trend here that they can be part of solving it.
Lazar, I so appreciate this conversation. We're at the end of the month of Ramadan. We're facing down Passover. I don't know if your cleaning is underway.
I've not started.
I know I haven't either. And Easter is, of course, around the corner as well. So I think this conversation is extremely timely, despite the war, despite the protests going on in Jerusalem that perhaps some of our listeners heard part of during our conversation right now. So Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another episode next week. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Until next week, Shalom. Yafeh.